Hello, my name is Alexa Havlicek, and this is my thesis presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to review this study. The current study examined paraprofessional use of differential reinforcement of other behavior procedures using behavioral skills training. Students with disabilities may often exhibit problem behaviors, and these behaviors may affect their learning and activities in their everyday lives. So in order for these instances of problem behavior to decrease, staff consistency is necessary. Petcher and Bailey, 2006, stated, "Instructional assistants and other public school employees are not necessarily trained to work with students with disabilities. Oftentimes, paraprofessionals are aware of these problem behaviors but are unsure how to handle them appropriately." Differential reinforcement of other behaviors can be an effective way to decrease instances of problem behaviors. Differential reinforcement of other behaviors is defined by Cooper, Heron, and Heward, 2007, as a procedure for decreasing problem behavior in which reinforcement is contingent on the absence of the problem behavior during or at specific times. For example, in studies conducted by Hagel and Ferguson, 2000, Luiselli et al., 1978, and Durwas and Jones, 1993, they found that differential reinforcement of other behaviors was effective in decreasing problem behaviors. Implementing DRO procedures have been shown to decrease problem behaviors. However, paraprofessionals may be unaware how to properly implement these procedures. Jones et al., 1999, Sorokoff and Sturmy, 2004, and Goetz, Holmberg, and LeBlanc, 1975, explain that behavioral skills training can be an effective intervention for teaching staff how to properly implement DRO procedures for students with disabilities. In studies conducted by Hogan, Nez, and Kong, 2015, and Rosales, Stone, and Rayfeld, 2009, they found that issuing a BST was effective in teaching staff members how to properly implement procedures. The purpose of the current study was to examine the effectiveness of BST to teach staff members how to correctly implement DRO procedures. The next slide talks about my methods section, which includes the participants, setting, materials, experimental design, independent and dependent variables, IOA, and the procedure. There were 3 participants in the current study, 2 males and 1 female. Diane was a 58-year-old Caucasian female and was a 1-to-1 aide in a self-contained high school classroom. Diane was suggested for the current study by the classroom teacher based on the increased need for correct implementation of behavioral techniques in the classroom. Diane had never been part of a staff training intervention before. Dale was a 29-year-old Hispanic male that was a 1-to-1 aide in a self-contained high school classroom. Dale was suggested for the current study by the classroom teacher based on the increased need for correct implementation of behavioral techniques in the classroom. Dale had never been part of a staff training before. Gary was a 25-year-old Hispanic male that was also a 1-to-1 aide in a special education high school classroom. Gary was suggested for the study by the classroom teacher based on the increased need for correct implementation of behavioral techniques in the classroom. And Gary had never been part of a staff training intervention before. The school in Northern Illinois. 2 classrooms were used in this study. The classroom used for Dale and Diane's observations was the Functional Academic Learning Program, or the FELP room. Gary's observation took place in the art room. The materials used for the current study included a pencil or pen, 8.5-inch by 11-inch college rolled paper, a Mac computer, Microsoft Excel 2016, Microsoft PowerPoint 2016, and a timer application called Countdown Simple Timer used on an iPhone. A multiple baseline design was used to show paraprofessionals' percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures. When Tier 1 showed stability during baseline, that participant was introduced to the independent variable, while participants 2 and 3 remained in baseline. Once the next participant showed stability, they were introduced to the independent variable, and participant 3 remained in baseline. Finally, when the third participant showed stability, they were introduced to the independent variable. The independent variable for the current study was the behavioral skills training, which included a combination of instructions, modeling, rehearsal, praise, and corrective feedback. There were 3 dependent variables for this study. The primary dependent variable was the frequency of paraprofessionals' correct implementation of DRO procedures. The secondary dependent variable of the current study was social validity, and the final dependent variable was the maintenance probe. Paraprofessionals' behavior was measured using momentary time sampling during one 20-minute observation broken down into 1-minute intervals for a total of 20 intervals. Momentary time sampling was used during baseline, intervention, and the maintenance phases. An iPhone timer application was used, and when the timer went off after 1 minute, the researcher looked up to see if the paraprofessional was correctly implementing the DRO procedure. If the behavior occurred, a tally was issued. For example, if the researcher looked up and saw that the paraprofessional was ignoring the target behavior, a tally would be issued. If the researcher looked up and saw that the other behavior was occurring and the paraprofessional was reinforcing that, a tally would be issued. If the target behavior was occurring and the paraprofessional was acknowledging that behavior in any way, there would be no tally issued. If any other behavior was occurring and the aide was not reinforcing that behavior, a tally was not issued. At the end of the 20-minute interval, the percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures performed by paraprofessionals was calculated. 2 independent observers collected data on the paraprofessionals using momentary time sampling. The researcher was informed of the operational definition of each of the target behaviors, as well as what had to occur in order to mark a tally, and under what circumstances they would not issue a tally. Both observers collected data during one of the 20-minute observation periods. Trial by trial was used for IOA and was collected by dividing the number of agreements by the number of agreements plus the number of disagreements and multiplied by 100. During baseline, the observation sessions were conducted during class periods 2 and 7, and data were collected until 3 stable data points were observed. When the timer went off each minute, the observer looked up at the paraprofessional to see if they were correctly implementing DRO procedures with their student. If they were, a tally was issued, and if they were not, no tally was issued. This was done until stability was observed. The behavioral skills training started off with a PowerPoint that was approximately 10 minutes long. The PowerPoint included 10 slides. The first slide included the definition of DRO. The second slide contained the reasoning why it was beneficial to use DRO and for what behaviors it can be used with. The third slide explained why we use DRO in the classroom. The next 3 slides were different for each paraprofessional and included examples of the paraprofessional students' target behaviors. These slides also included what should and should not be done for the target behaviors. The 7th slide contained the definition of reinforcement and examples of different types of reinforcement that could be used. The 8th slide contained the definition of extinction and examples of how to use it. The 9th slide explained what would be done during the modeling phase, and the 10th slide explained what would be done during role play. After the paraprofessionals watched the PowerPoint, the modeling phase began, and during this phase, the researcher role played as each paraprofessional, and the paraprofessional acted as their student. So the paraprofessional acted out their student's target behavior, and the researcher demonstrated how to ignore the problem behaviors and reinforce the other appropriate behaviors. The next step of BST was the role play, and during this, the paraprofessional acted as themselves, and the researcher acted as their student. For this, the researcher acted out the paraprofessional student's problem behavior, along with other appropriate behaviors, and the paraprofessional demonstrated how they would ignore the problem behavior and reinforce the appropriate behaviors. Following the role play, each paraprofessional was provided with verbal feedback, beginning with what they did well and followed by what could have been done differently. And then they were asked if they had any questions. Maintenance was conducted 3 days following intervention, and during this phase, data was collected on the paraprofessional's percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures. The researcher used momentary time sampling during one 20-minute observation session, broken down into 1-minute intervals for a total of 20 intervals. This slide gives a visual representation of the current study. So we started with baseline and then began our intervention, which was behavioral skills training. We then observed the paraprofessionals' percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures and conducted a maintenance phase, and then provided the participants with a social validity questionnaire. The results for the current study were effective as shown by the graph. The x-axis represents the sessions for each participant, and the y-axis represents the percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures for the paraprofessionals across baseline, intervention, and maintenance phases. Diane showed stable responding at 0% for all 3 baseline sessions and had a mean of 0%. Diane showed a significant increase in level from baseline to intervention and began intervention with 65% correct implementation of DRO procedures. This trend continues increasing during the rest of the intervention sessions, as she shows 90% during the second intervention session, 95% for the third, 95% for the fourth, and ends the intervention phase with 100% correct implementation of DRO procedures. The closed circles mark baseline and intervention phases, and the open circle represents maintenance. Diane showed 95% correct implementation during the maintenance phase, and there were no overlapping data points between baseline and intervention. Dale showed stable responding during baseline with a mean of 1.7% correct implementation. Dale shows an increase in level from baseline to intervention and began the intervention session with 80% correct implementation. During the second intervention session, he shows 85%. During the third, he shows 95%. The fourth, he shows 95%. And he ends the intervention phase with 95% correct implementation of DRO procedures. The closed circles represent the baseline and intervention phases, and the open circles represent the maintenance phase. There were no overlapping data points between baseline and intervention. Gary also showed stable responding during baseline and had a mean of 5% correct implementation. A significant increase in level was shown from baseline to intervention. Gary began the intervention phase with 75% correct implementation and continued showing an increase in trend, with his second intervention session showing 85%, his third session showing 90%, and his fourth showing 90%. There was a slight decrease shown in the final intervention phase at 85%, but he shows an increase in maintenance with 90% and ends the maintenance phase with 95% correct implementation of DRO procedures. The closed circles represent baseline and intervention phases, and the open circle represents the maintenance phase. There were no overlapping data points between baseline and intervention. This slide shows the procedural reliability checklist that was used for participants. This was delivered to the second observer following the behavioral skills training in order to evaluate if materials were organized prior to the BST, if DRO was accurately defined, if there was a modeling and role-play phase, if feedback was provided, and if instructions were clearly stated to the paraprofessionals prior to running the session. Procedural reliability was collected 100% of the time for all 3 paraprofessionals and was collected at 100% across all trainings. This slide contains the social validity questionnaire that was provided to the participants once the maintenance phase had ended. The first purpose of the social validity questionnaire was to see if paraprofessionals knew what DRO was and how to implement it prior to the study, and the second purpose was to determine if the study was beneficial and had an impact on the staff's use of DRO procedures. The questionnaire consisted of 8 questions that the paraprofessionals had to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being that they strongly agreed with the statement, and 1 being that they strongly disagreed. The first question asked if the participant knew what DRO was prior to the current study. The second question asked if the participant knew how to implement DRO procedures prior to the current study. The third question asked if the BST was helpful. The fourth question asked if the paraprofessional knew how to properly use DRO procedures. The fifth question asked if the paraprofessional thought their students' target behavior had decreased. The sixth question asked if the students' other appropriate behavior had increased. The seventh question asked if the current intervention could be used in the classroom in the future. And the eighth question asked the paraprofessional if they would use the intervention with students in the future. The results of the questionnaires indicated that the paraprofessionals thought the BST was helpful and they now know how to properly implement a DRO procedure following the intervention. The results of the questionnaires also indicated that all three participants did not know what a DRO procedures were or how to implement them prior to the study. All three participants scored questions 1 and 2 with a 1. Diane, Dale, and Gary scored the third and fourth questions with a 5, which is the highest rating on the questionnaire. Diane scored question 5 of 4, while Dale and Gary both scored that question a 5. Questions 6, 7, and 8 were all scored a 5 by the paraprofessionals. This indicated that the participants found the intervention to be helpful and effective in decreasing their students' problem behaviors. This slide starts the discussion, and the current study demonstrated that issuing a behavioral skills training to paraprofessionals can increase their percentages of correct implementation of DRO procedures. Hagel and Ferguson 2000 and Nurnberger, Vargo, and Ringdahl 2012 found that the use of DRO procedures effectively decreased problem behaviors. According to Jones et al. 1999, Sorokoff and Sturmy 2004, Goetz, Holmberg, and LeBlanc 1975, behavioral skills training can be an effective intervention for teaching staff how to properly implement DRO procedures for students with disabilities. Sorokoff and Sturmy 2004 found that the use of a BST training was effective in training teachers how to properly implement discrete trial teaching. The current study showed strong evidence that implementing a BST will increase paraprofessionals' percentages of correct implementation of DRO procedures. However, there were some limitations that should be noted. The first limitation would be generalization. This study was conducted in the same classroom each day for their participant. It is unknown as to whether or not the paraprofessionals' percentages would remain stable if data was collected in a different classroom or during a different class period. The second limitation would be that although momentary time sampling is an effective data collection system for teachers, it has the potential to underestimate target behaviors. It is difficult to say if the paraprofessional was consistently implementing DRO procedures or if they just happened to be implementing the DRO procedure when the researcher looked up after the interval. A third limitation would be that no formal data was collected on the student's behavior. While it is important to have formal data on paraprofessional implementation, it would be of significance to see if the procedure helped the students as well. Future research could benefit from conducting a generalization phase looking at other trainings besides BST to see if they would be more effective in training staff members how to properly implement DRO procedures. Overall, the results of the current study indicate that the use of BST increases paraprofessionals' percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures. This study provides further research that issuing a BST can increase paraprofessionals' percentage of correct implementation of DRO procedures in the classroom. While challenging behaviors occur frequently in special education classrooms, if staff are properly implementing procedures, they can come into contact with reinforcement just from observing the students' problem behaviors decreasing.